Rock music, a genre that has defined the cultural landscape for more than half a century, has its roots in a combination of musical traditions, social changes, and technological innovations. From its origins in the 1940s and 1950s to its many transformations in the decades that followed, rock music has evolved in response to changing times, creating diverse subgenres and influencing countless other musical styles. Here, we explore the history of rock music, tracing its origins, key developments, and transformations throughout the years. The story of rock music begins in the 1940s, during a time when African American musical traditions were undergoing a profound transformation. Rhythm and blues, which emerged from the blues and gospel music, was the primary precursor to rock music. R&B musicians like Ray Charles, Big Joe Turner, and Fats Domino were creating a new, faster-paced and more rhythmically driven form of blues music. At the same time, country and western music, which was predominantly performed by white artists, was also evolving. Artists like Hank Williams and Bob Wills blended elements of traditional folk and blues with swing and jazz influences. In the early 1950s, the growing popularity of electric blues, pioneered by artists such as Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf, began to have a significant impact on the emerging rock sound. These artists integrated electric guitars and amplified sound into their performances, helping to create the loud, energetic aesthetic that would come to define rock music. At the same time, honky-tonk and rockabilly emerged as distinct genres within the larger context of country and blues. One of the earliest examples of rock music as we understand it today came with the rise of Elvis Presley, whose unique fusion of R&B, gospel, and country music took the world by storm. Presley's success beginning in 1954 with songs like That's Alright and Heartbreak Hotel marked the beginning of rock's mainstream popularity. Presley was a key figure in creating a sound that bridged the gap between white and black musical traditions, a central feature of rock's later development. The birth of rock and roll was further cemented by Chuck Berry, whose guitar riffs and energetic performances helped to establish the genre's rebellious spirit. Berry's songs like Johnny B. Good in 1958 combined rhythm and blues with a more structured, danceable beat, laying the groundwork for the rock music that followed. Alongside Berry, artists such as Little Richard and Buddy Holly also played a pivotal role in shaping the early sound of rock music, contributing dynamic stage performances and catchy melodies. By the late 1950s, rock and roll had become a global phenomenon, influencing not only music but also youth culture. However, the genre's dominance faced a challenge in the early 1960s due to the decline of rock's original stars, most notably Elvis Presley's transition into movies and the tragic death of Buddy Holly in a plane crash in 1959. During the early 1960s, the Beatles emerged as a defining force in rock music. Their innovative approach to songwriting and production, exemplified in albums such as Rubber Soul from 1965 and Revolver from 1966, revolutionized the genre and laid the foundation for what would become known as classic rock. The Beatles' use of studio techniques, complex song structures, and lyrical experimentation broke the traditional constraints of popular music. Alongside the Beatles, other British bands such as the Rolling Stones, The Who, and the Kinks brought a raw, rebellious energy to rock that would define the genre for years to come. In the United States, the mid-1960s saw the rise of folk rock, a movement led by artists like Bob Dylan and the Byrds. Dylan's shift from acoustic folk to electric rock music with the release of Highway 61 Revisited in 1965 was a pivotal moment in the evolution of rock. His poetic lyrics and social consciousness resonated with a new generation of listeners, and his influence extended far beyond folk music, helping to shape the emerging rock aesthetic. The evolution of rock music during this period was also marked by the rise of surf rock with the Beach Boys and garage rock with the Sonics, both of which added regional and stylistic diversity to the genre. Surf rock, with its reverb-heavy guitar tones, epitomized the sunny, carefree side of rock, while garage rock characterized by its lo-fi production and raw energy, contributed to the development of punk rock in the years to come. By the late 1960s, rock music entered a period of experimentation and artistic exploration, known as the psychedelic era. Influenced by the counterculture movement, the Vietnam War, and the widespread use of drugs like LSD, rock music became a platform for artists to experiment with new sounds, both musical and lyrical. The Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band from 1967 is often regarded as a landmark album in this genre, using studio techniques like tape loops, backward recordings, and orchestration to create an otherworldly, surreal atmosphere. Other bands, such as The Doors, Jimi Hendrix, and Cream, also pushed rock's boundaries, blending blues, jazz, and experimental music into a genre that became known as psychedelic rock. The genre was marked by long instrumental jams, elaborate live shows, and a focus on creating altered states of consciousness, both for the musicians and their listeners. Parallel to psychedelic rock, a more experimental and heavier sound was emerging, led by bands such as Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath. Hard rock and the birth of heavy metal marked the darker, louder, and more distorted sound of rock. Led Zeppelin's self-titled debut album from 1969 showcased virtuosic guitar playing, intense vocals, and a hard-hitting rhythm section, elements that would come to define hard rock and metal. Meanwhile, Black Sabbath's Paranoid from 1970 introduced a more ominous and aggressive sound, cementing the foundations of heavy metal. The 1970s witnessed significant diversity in rock music, with several distinct subgenres gaining prominence. The rise of glam rock, led by artists like David Bowie and T-Rex, blended theatrical performances, gender fluidity, and a mix of rock and glam fashion. Bowie's Ziggy Stardust in 1972 created an iconic androgynous alter ego, challenging societal norms and redefining rock's visual and conceptual elements. While glam rock was celebrating excess and spectacle, punk rock emerged in the mid-1970s as a reaction against the perceived bloatedness and commercialism of mainstream rock. Bands like the Ramones, Sex Pistols, and The Clash stripped rock music down to its rawest form, simple, fast, and rebellious. Punk rejected the technical virtuosity of 1970s rock in favor of a more direct, DIY approach, emphasizing anti-establishment lyrics and nonconformist attitude. Punk was not just a musical style. It was a cultural movement and challenged the social, political, and economic norms of the time. The 1980s saw a wave of hair metal bands like Motley Crue, Def Leppard, and Bon Jovi achieve massive commercial success. These bands mixed hard rock with a polished, glam-infused aesthetic, focusing on catchy hooks, anthemic choruses, and big production values. Hair metal represented rock's commercialization as these bands capitalized on the power of MTV and video music culture to reach massive audiences. Simultaneously, the alternative rock movement began to take shape, emerging from the underground scene. Bands like R.E.M., The Smiths, and the Pixies helped shape alternative rock's more introspective, indie-leaning sound. The genre gained significant traction in the late 1980s and early 1990s, especially with the rise of grunge in the Pacific Northwest, led by Nirvana and Pearl Jam. Grunge was raw, emotional, and politically charged, often mixing elements of punk and heavy metal, and it soon dominated the mainstream rock scene. In the 1990s, alternative rock exploded in popularity, with Nirvana's Nevermind in 1991 becoming the defining album of the era. Grunge's success paved the way for other alternative subgenres, including post-punk, indie rock, and nu metal. The latter part of the decade saw the rise of punk pop and nu metal with bands like Green Day, Linkin Park, and Korn, blending punk, metal, and hip-hop into new, commercial-friendly forms of rock. Rock music's evolution has been characterized by constant innovation, experimentation, and adaptation. From its roots in rhythm and blues, rockabilly, and country to its domination of the 1960s and 1970s, rock has continually pushed musical boundaries, giving birth to numerous subgenres. Its impact on culture, fashion, and youth movements remains profound, and even as the genre has fragmented into diverse styles, rock music's legacy continues to influence new generations of musicians and listeners. The evolution of rock, from its rebellious beginnings to its mainstream successes, is a testament to its enduring relevance and power.